Okay, I had to redo the, anyway. So Tim and Ali are sick, so they're going to be joining us over Zoom. And I'll archive today's session so we can look at it and you guys can look at it as well. So just a couple things. As you requested, so I made a, in the folder, we'll have the 3 handouts from today, because the one, fiber errata list is just a partial count. So actually, the errata list is 26 pages long. So obviously, you can have that as a resource, but for today's purpose, we're just going to be focusing on the first couple pages. And then the Stravinsky tempo recording, I basically downloaded the entire article. And so I just printed out the 4 pages or so where it's Stravinsky's comments on different recording tempos. So we'll talk about that. So the purpose of today is I'm going to talk you through these 3 documents as a template. Not that you have to do a half-hour version, right? And I'll try to do sort of limited to like maybe 15-minute for each. Okay, so I'm kind of modeling how you would do the presentation of your project after Thanksgiving, when you're going to be sharing your review of either an article or a chapter of a conducting textbook. Okay, so I'm modeling 3 different versions, and this is sort of the expectation of how you should be doing sort of a deep dive and sharing the document with us. Okay, all right. So first one is Rufus Jones Jr.'s article on the Conductors Guild journal. Okay, and that's a really great resource where different conductors contribute to the field by either doing reviews of books about conductors, in fact, doing what I'm asking you to do for this assignment. Okay, so they review many different kinds of resources and in a number of different ways. So, for example, I closed that one. So I'll just open one at random, and so the nice thing is all of these Conductors Guild journals are archived, so you are able to access them. So and conductors from the field regularly contribute to it, just as musicologists and scholars have their own, AMS journal and different ways of contributing to the field by writing about different topics. So they range from, this one is a correspondence between Bruno Walter and Adrian Balt, a 40-year friendship. So it's kind of going through the primary sources of letters, okay, and then presenting a paper about what they found in those letters. Another one is this person did interpreting Leslie Bassett's Sound, Shapes, and Symbols. It's a new orchestral work from a conductor's point of view, different kinds of things that are challenging about the piece. This one's about the 4th horn in Beethoven 9th Symphony. So there are very specific dives into different issues related to conducting. This one is Clint F. Nieweg is a orchestral librarian, but also a conductor. And his errata list is really comprehensive and sought out. So whenever Clinton does a score in parts, in this case, L'Après-midi d'Enfant, this is really valuable for conductors because he'll go through actual scores and parts and goes through all of the things that are errors in the scores and parts. So incredibly valuable deep dive that Clinton does. And he's done throughout his career, he's about in his 70s now. He's done about 125 pieces where he's gone through every single part and made an errata list. Then there'll be book reviews. So a typical Conductors Guild journal will have about this many topics discussed, right? I'll send you a resource link where you can access all those journal articles, okay? So I think one of the things that I'm trying to have you think about is, I think when I was younger as a conductor, I didn't really think about how I could contribute to the field because I thought about all the scores that I need to learn, all the things that I need to learn as a young conductor, that the thought never entered my mind that I could be the one contributing by editing pieces, by transcribing pieces, by doing an errata list or doing an interview of a conductor, doing an analysis or a practical way of how would you perform this contemporary music piece, right? What are the issues in a traditional work that we all face as conductors that need to be discussed and solved, right? So in the beginning of the process, maybe the first 20 years of my career, the focus was on getting the input, right? So that I'm doing research and I'm learning from people who have gone before me and trying to put things into my head as much as possible, right? So I was in basically input mode, right? And I think for all of us, I hope that you will never stop that mode as a composer, as a conductor, as a musician. I think one of the saddest things I see is older musicians who have decided, I'm not interested in input anymore, right? And that may result in a variety of forms. I've had performers say to me, I'm not interested in contemporary music, right? They're not interested in input, right? They're only interested in pieces that they've learned, honed, and mastered, right? And I think that's a really destructive way to be a musician as an artist. As an artist, you should be continually trying to expand your comfort zone. Meaning, if there are repertoire you're not comfortable with, if there's repertoire that you do not know, if there are composers that you have never performed, whether they're alive or dead, right? I think a healthy artist in which there's always an input of information, repertoire, so that you're growing as an artist, as a composer, as a conductor, right? So I hope you never stop that input mode, right? We should be in that input mode, always ready to expand our knowledge base, right? But what I was a little bit hesitant about was, as a young conductor, I don't have much to output, right? I don't have much to share. And in fact, all of us as musicians have really valuable and should be involved in this process of input-output, okay? And the mistake I made earlier in my career is that I still have a lot to learn, so anything I output would not be valuable. But what's one of the best ways to learn how to do something? Doing it, yes, definitely. What's even better than that? Yes, okay. So if you really want to master something, okay, sometimes people talk about being able to present an hour-long talk, a 20-minute talk, a 5-minute talk, and a 1-minute pitch, right? Like an elevator pitch. Okay, you have a 1-minute ride up to the top floor, and you have 1 minute to make your elevator pitch, right? So almost anybody can do an hour-long pitch, well, let me say that again. It's much easier to do an hour-long presentation and much harder to hone that down to a smaller number of minutes, right? And then if you're doing a presentation if I'm doing a presentation to other conductors for an hour, that's really easy, because I can assume a lot of shared base knowledge, right? But if I'm sharing to a group who are not conductors, who don't have the same expert base as I do, right? So I have to explain things in a clear, basic layman's term, right? In order for you to do that, you have to have much higher mastery of your information, right? like a computer scientist talking to other computer scientists. They can just assume a lot of shared knowledge, okay? But a computer scientist talking to a user who's gonna use that app that they created, they're gonna have to really know all of the background, all of the things that happen in the background of the app. That it doesn't matter if they explain that, that's not gonna really matter to the user, right? So if you are able to talk to a layperson, so for example, if you're a composer talking to an audience, right? So you have to have mastery of material to a much higher degree. Okay, so I was talking about input output. As a person, beginning out your career as a young composer, as a young conductor, don't make the same mistake I did, which is to assume I don't have much to offer in my output, because I'm still busy inputting information and knowledge and repertoire. But in fact, one of the best ways to master that knowledge that you're trying to input is to try to explain it to another person. Explain to another person, how do I get through this piece, right? What is the zigzag things that I need to do, right? What at every beat, what am I doing with that beat? Being able to explain what you're doing, right? What you're trying to accomplish physically, right? Trying to talk about repertoire that should be played, right? You should be exploring repertoire that is unknown and not discovered, right? And then becoming the champion of that unknown repertoire, right? Because the older conductors aren't doing it. They're already set with their own repertoire of 40 pieces that they're ever going to conduct. Right? So in fact, actually, it's up to the younger generation to push the boundaries and say, this is a worthy composer that should be championed. Right? And in fact, if all you're doing is the same old repertoire, and you don't really have a champion and repertoire that you're trying to bring forth because you believe in that repertoire, you're not really expanding the repertoire. You're just kind of going over the old pathways that's already been tread on by many conductors and musicians, right? So for the audience, for the orchestra, well, why would I listen to a conductor who just started doing Beethoven 5 versus a conductor who's been doing Beethoven 5 for 4 years, right? So in fact, I try to have a stance in which I was focused on broadening my repertoire rather than becoming deeper in a particular set of repertoire. Okay, so output, input, you need to have a healthy balance of that, not just all input in the beginning of your career, and don't think of it as you're going to be all output at the end of your career. Okay. So what I've tried to do is I've given you a couple things to follow up on last class. So this assignment, adding to the resource stock of underrepresented composers. What I would like for you to do, this will be due on the last session as well, but this is sort of an open-ended deadline because this is a resource that I hope that you will continue to use and explore and add to, right? And every time I teach a course, I encourage conductors, young musicians to use this resource, explore the resource, and then please add to this resource. Right? As my uncle and my mom used to always say, 2 fools is better than one smart kid. Okay? So by myself, this resource would not be as rich and varied. Right? So I expect you to add to this by contributing to this resource. So that link is the one that we talked about in detail last time. Where is the? Oh, thank you. Yeah. So that's the resource, right? So when you add your resource for our class purpose, you put your name, you're the person who added that resource, and then a synopsis of what this resource is. Okay, what particular, if there are particular composers you can find through this, how you can, this particular resource is helpful to expanding the repertoire. Okay, so that'll be due on Thursday. Okay, now going back to the conducting textbook review assignment, which is due the Tuesday after Thanksgiving break. All right. I'll model the three in maybe 15 or 20-minute reviews so that you can do a similar thing. So the expectation is that you'll pick, it could be an article, like the Dixon article, it could be a chapter of a book. I said there are Stravinsky reviews. Or it can be like a Message Sales Journal article, which is a short place. So whatever resource is, it doesn't matter, but it's for you to use your critical acumen to say whether this is a useful article, what was useful, okay? The written text should be about 2 pages of text, reviewing and summarizing the material, and then you'll do a 10-minute presentation to class where you present the material. Okay, I'm hoping that we can get all of them done on that Tuesday, so we can have the wrap-up session on Thursday. Okay, but if we need to lead into Thursday, we can do that as well. Okay, but think of it as a 10-minute presentation. Okay, all right. Okay, so I'll model sort of three things, and you can also, if the particular topic, right, requires to go outside the article itself, then by all means do so, because you need to know about the topic that they're talking about in order to be critical of it. Right? Okay, so let's start with the Dixon article. Just for this, I have to go to the next browser. So I did a quick search about Dean Dixon because I found this article in the Conductors Guild journal. And Rufus Jones is a person I had encountered in our conductor workshop. So this particular article is a much shorter version of that article. And basically, Dean Dixon was a conductor, a Black American conductor. He was born in, graduating from Juilliard and Columbia in the early 1930s. So you can just imagine as an African-American young musician trying to find a job at that time was pretty much close to impossible. And in 31, he formed his own orchestra and choral society, and he guest conducted the NBC Symphony, which is pretty much the most prestigious orchestra at the time. But yet he was, and he had many engagements with Philadelphia and Boston. So he was really a maverick in a sense that as an African-American conductor, he was able to find these invitations because obviously they recognized his talents. But that did not lead to any sense of any sort of music directorship in the United States. So he ended up leaving the States to become the music director of Gothenburg's Symphony Orchestra in Sweden. So he was there for 53 to 60, and then he was at Frankfurt Radio for 61 to 74. And then he was briefly a music director in Australia, Sydney, from 64 to 67. So despite having been recognized in Europe and having a career, he never really was able to find a music directorship in the US. He was invited to guest conduct many different orchestras like Chicago, National Symphony, Philadelphia, Detroit, Milwaukee, Pittsburgh Symphony, St. Louis, San Francisco. But it never materialized in a music directorship of an American professional orchestra. And so Rufus Jones, with this article, goes into much more detail about his upbringing and how he became a conductor. And it's quite interesting. First couple pages is about his training and the challenges he's faced. Dean Dixon is the subject of Rufus Jones's doctoral thesis for his conducting degree as a UVA candidate. So I'm glad that Rufus went and researched a conductor that might have been forgotten and lost to history, because it's in fact hard to find recordings by Dean Dixon. I did manage to find a few. Here's a footage of Dean Dixon rehearsing in German orchestra in '61. Let's just look at it briefly.
This is langsam vorlegen. Der am Doppelstrich 1, 3,
So you can find actually during his Frankfurt years, because he was head of the radio orchestra, there's actually 15 years of archival recordings by Dean Dixon, which is another sort of a rich source material that you can go through. But the issue was finding actual video footage of him that was actually quite difficult. So this is one of maybe 3 or 4 that's available online right now. Okay, and I'm hoping that there are more research done so that we will be able to see him and not just hear him. But his years at the Frankfurt Radio Orchestra is pretty well represented in archived audio form. Okay. All right. I would say that Rufus Jones's article, what I wish was there were more links to like, for example, like it talked a great deal about his childhood and upbringing, but it just left a lot of information not explored, right? Where can I find videos of him connected? Where can I find his recordings? Are there recordings? Are there commercial recordings? So I wish he had delved more into that. And I'm sure in his larger format DMA thesis, he might have gone into that, but he doesn't go into that in this particular article. Okay. Any questions regarding Dean Dixon and Rufus Jones's newsletter article?
Can you send like that video and like others?
Yeah, I'll send those links and put them on. Yeah. Okay. All right. So it can be as simple as that. All right, so there's an article, there's a particular topic about a conductor, and you explore further and look at other resources so that you can compare, has this person done the homework? Has this person actually found resources that are available? All right, now let's go to Score and Parts by Jonathan Sternberg. Okay, so Jonathan Sternberg is another a contributor who's a conducting pedagogue, who's done a lot of these articles where he goes in and makes an errata list of scores and parts for different pieces. This particular one is doing a score and parts errata list for Stravinsky's Firebird Suite. And in fact, it goes on. I only printed out the first 4 pages. It's double-sided, okay, but it's actually a 22-page document, all right, which I put in the resource folder for the handouts for today. So he talks about, so he addresses many of the issues with the Stravinsky ballets. In fact, all 3 of them, the Firebird, Petrushka, and Rite of Spring, were one of Stravinsky's earliest successes, but they're also riddled with problems in terms of the sheer quantity of errors that are in the parts. You know, Jonathan talks briefly about why that's so in the second paragraph, although I think that is another paper all in itself, why there are such a huge problems with sets of parts. In fact, one of my students, and David Daniels, was part of a team. They produced a brand new set of parts and scores for Stravinsky Rite of Spring, just like 3 years ago. And so it was a massive undertaking. It took about 12 years of editing and re-engraving. And the score, the sheer list of errata goes on for like 60 or 70 pages. It's just a massive list of errors that are present in the parts that are currently being rented out by Boosey and Hawkes. Right? So many of the conductors and orchestra librarians, in many ways, many of the orchestras have their own errata list, right? So people like Jonathan Stenberg and Clinton Nevek, what they've done is they've sort of compiled a lot of these errata lists and compiled sort of a complete errata list. Right? So this is not a complete errata list, but this is sort of just one person's effort in making the errata list. So it ranges from, let's just go to the second page. Right, and do you see the check marks that's right by it? Those are mine. So I went through the set of parts that I had access to, and I went through whether the error had been corrected or not. So if it's just a simple check, then it is in the part as incorrect, as stated in the errata list. And then check circle means I sort of actually fixed it in the part, so it's ready. Okay. So for example, like after rehearsal number 1, bar 4, second violin, there should be a senza sword, meaning take the mute out, right? And so these types of things, it's in some ways innocuous. It's not as bad as an actual wrong note, right? So a mute still on the second violin versus mute not on the second violin is not a sonic event that's going to be that audible. It'll be much worse if the second violin had a C sharp instead of a C natural, right? So some of the ones, like dynamic is 3 Ps for horn 4. Okay, no one's really going to hear that. But in the engraving, in the part, it doesn't unify with the other parts. So sometimes the errors are innocuous in some ways, and sometimes the errors are much more, consequential, right? So my criticism of this set of scoring corrections is that I wish he had done a little more, maybe some sort of level of seriousness of the error, right? So if you had maybe color-coded or coded, this is sort of DEFCON 1 or DEFCON 5 error, right? So that if you go through 22 pages of errata list, sometimes I felt like, okay, like I went through and looked for those like 100 errata lists, and in fact, maybe 60% of it was like inconsequential, right? 3P is missing from that's not really that critical of an error, right? So I wished he had done a little bit of sorting so that, okay, here are things, if you don't fix, it'll be an audible event, right? And then here are things sort of, if you have time to fix them, right? Fix it, right? So I wish there was sort of a layering of most important and critical errors to fix to sort of picking the right color for the wallpaper kind of errors, right? And then what I also wished was he doesn't specify the publisher or which edition. In fact, for Firebird, there are maybe 7 different editions. So just having that critical information right up front would have been really helpful because there are edited versions that have fixed many of these problems. So I wish he had specified which suite, which is it the 1910, is it the 1919, is it 1947, right? Because Stravinsky, he redid the set of parts in 1947, knowing that his copyright is going to run out. So Because he wanted to be paid. And he knew that once the 1910 copy would run out, he would not get it would be going to the public domain. So in 1947, he did a brand new edition that really didn't have much changes. I mean, it had changes, but it wasn't enough that you really had to use the 1947 edition. Okay, but the 1947 edition does fix many of these errors. Like the 3P is missing in the fourth horn, and the accent is missing, and the stanza sword sign is missing in the second line. That sort of mistakes. Okay. So in some sense, not specifying which edition this is dealing with, in fact, if you're dealing with the 1947 edition, this is sort of moot because most of them have been dealt with. Okay. All right. Yeah.
How does he know, like, what is like the error? Like, besides, like obvious, like, tonality or whatever, but, like, is it like listening to a recording and then, like, oh, the, like, quieter here is going to like.
Oh, so that's a really great point. So like what is the mechanics by you decided this was an error, right? And what Jonathan Sternberg says is that he went to the manuscript and scanned the manuscript and compared the published version versus the manuscript, right? And when there's a discrepancy between a published scoring parts versus Stravinsky's manuscript, that's when he made these list of erratas that's not matching.
So what would like the fault of like the people that made
That engraved the parts for the publisher.
okay,
Yeah,
not like
yeah. In fact, that happens a lot where the composers send a manuscript, but it may be an earlier version, right? But they've already went to print. In fact, Mahler's process turnaround of his symphony was about 4 years, right? He would work in a hut in Austria somewhere and have a version, and then he would bring that version to New York Philharmonic, like read it, right? And then he would go through massive editing, right? And then, and that's even before it's engraved. So the first read with the New York Philharmonic would be with just manuscript parts. And then he would re-edit that, and that process would take 2 summers. And then he would have a set of performances, first set of performances, and then after that, in some cases, he would edit it further. But sometimes the version the publishers get their hands on may not be the final version. Okay. Bruckner, for example, had a lot of well-meaning friends who are conductors and composers who would give feedback after the premiere of his symphonies, right? And Bruckner was not a strong enough personality to say, no, that's not what I wanted, this is what I wanted. He would sort of listen to somebody say, you know, do you think that's the right tempo? Oh, maybe that's, yeah, okay, and he would change it. So in fact, Bruckner's later versions had so many edited changes that were problematic and actually didn't help the piece, but he wasn't strong enough of a personality to say no to feedback from different conductors and composers. Okay. So a Bruckner symphony, there are like 9 different editions that you have to wade through and decide, okay, which one do I, right? So there's a lot of scholarship and argument. Do we do the Haas edition? Do we do the, you know, and so there's a lot of conflict in between different editions and which is the proper sort of authoritative version. Okay. All right. So that's Jonathan Sternberg's scoring parts. Questions? So in your presentation, you should also have a session where you open up to Q&A session where students can, your colleagues can ask questions about a particular article, paper, what you've encountered through your research process. So what would be some good questions to ask about this? Question?
Question.
Yeah.
I think what we added to the presentation would show maybe different orchestras playing, one releasing some of these changes and one not.
Okay, good point. Yeah, yeah. Absolutely. So that would be a really great feedback. Okay. Another feedback would be, well, is there another errata list that's different than this one? Is there one that's conflicting? There are. Okay, I just haven't brought it today, but that'll be something that I will go further into. Okay. All right. You can also do a deeper dive into a particular errata list, and maybe you might come up with your own set of if it was me dealing with this piece as a conductor, and I'm performing this with the Optional Symphony, then I would go through it and go through the parts and decide, okay, which of these errata list items I'm going to put in the scoring parts. Okay.
How does that word that you're using?
Errata. E-R-R-A-T-A.
Is that error?
Yeah, errors. Yeah. Okay. All right. So now let's go to the next item. Sorry, yeah. Okay. So this one I found to be quite interesting. So these are from a set of recordings that Stravinsky did. And so Stravinsky reviewed 4 other recordings by different conductors. And I think the 4 conductors that reviews are Boulez, himself recording, Bernstein, and another conductor. So all of these recordings are from different, so he would take a metronome marking and say what his take on, right? So this is the rehearsal number. This is the marked tempo in the score of Rite of Spring. Okay, so sorry. Right, so if it's marked 108, in a particular recording, it would say 112. So it would say too fast. Another place is marked 160. Tempo on the recording is 144. You mark too slow. Mark is 168. Tempo on recording 152, too slow. 60 versus 80, too fast. 80 versus 108, too fast. Okay. So you might say, well, obviously, if it's faster or slower than the marked recording, isn't that common sense that you would say it's too slow if it's too slow, if it's too fast, too fast? But what's interesting is that some of these were his own recordings. So when he was in conducting his own piece, he had different scores. Let's see. So I think the K, B1, B2, and C, those are the shorthand for the different conductors. And here it tells you who is who. K is Karajan, B1 is Boulez with the Orchestre National de la Radio of France, and then second one is Boulez with Cleveland Orchestra, M is Maida, S is Stravinsky. Okay, so here it's a little more helpful chart because rather than the first one where we don't know who he's talking about. So here, Ritual of the Abduction, dotted chord equals 132. Karajan is 132. Go very fast is good. So even though he was right on the mark, he says it's a bit fast, but it's good, right? Boulez is 126 and 116. Maida is 116. He says perniciously slow, sluggish. His own tempo is 120. Right? So even though he wrote 132, he conducted 120, and then his opinion of Karajan's recording at 132 is it's a bit fast, but it's good. So that gives us a little more insight than the first set of data points, right? Okay, let's look at spring rounds. Okay, marked tempo in the score is 108. Karajan is 69. Boulez 1 is 104. Boulez is 100. And on the Boulez 100, on the slow side, but greatly to be preferred to my own very hurried reading. So his recording is 112, faster than 108, and he admits, yeah, mine was too fast. And then Maida is 69, which is like, if it's my 108, you do 69. So that's way off data points, okay? And Maida, who made the error of going too slow, makes the error of going too fast. When marked score in spring rounds, chord equals 160. And then he conducts in the recording 144, and he says that mine was too slow. Right? Whereas Karajan Boulez nails it at 160, and then Boulez goes a little fast, and Maida goes 168, a bit faster than 160. All right? Ritual Tribes, Cordy goes 168 is metronome mark score. Karajan is right on the money at 168. Boulez is a bit slower, 160, 160. Maida is 160, and Stravinsky himself conducts 152 and marks too slow. Okay, all right. A slow tempo, Cordy goes 42, Boulez 58, more than twice too fast. Well, it's not twice too fast, but yeah, I guess. And then Maida's 52, too fast. Stravinsky, he nails it on the mark, 42. My performance is no better than the other two. So he was probably not happy with his own recording. So, and so on that, okay? So what I find is, you know, with any other piece where I don't have the composer's feedback of different recordings, I find this to be really fascinating. Not only has, it's not just a regular review of different tempos, like different conductors, right? There's an additional layer of what did Stravinsky say, right? And then a third layer of what was Stravinsky's own recording, right? So I find this to be an incredibly useful document in trying to determine what is the right tempo for right string, right? Because not only do you have Stravinsky's written marked tempos in the score, right? You have Stravinsky's own recording. Okay, but it's different. But what do you do with that? Do you go with the recording, or do you go with the marked score? Right? That's the perennial problem when you find, you're lucky enough to find recordings of works conducted by the composer. Right? Do you go with the marked score, or do you go with what's on the recording? Because obviously the composer was conducting, so that is a valid set of data points. But here, it's even better because it goes through, and Stravinsky is reviewing not only other conductors' recordings and tempos, but his own tempos. So then you come to a point where, okay, so you get a really clearer picture of the tempo markings that's on the score, and then you can evaluate the composer's recording and say, okay, he says it was too slow as well, right? So I find this document to be really, really helpful in trying to determine what is the right tempo of in this case, right of spring. Okay. So here, you know, it goes into even more details rather than just slow or fast, right? Like something like this, where Maida is 116 when its half equals 144. The pulsation should be exactly the same as in the previous dance, and not as here adjusted for a slow tempo. Right? So that's an instance of metric modulation where, you know, what used to be a quarter becomes a half note. And Stravinsky didn't want that pulsation to change. But Maida changes the pulsation to something that's sort of 30% slower. Okay? So that gives an even clearer indication of what you need to be in terms of tempo. Make sense? Yeah.
It says that for the last one there, the tempo is perfect for two of them. You know that it's kind of like a 60 difference.
Yeah. So whenever somebody says, okay, it says one tempo, marked tempo in the score is 144. So why would you ever deviate from that? Would there be a situation where you have to deviate from that tempo? What would be the situation?
I mean, if there's like faster ones and I hear orchestra need a little bit more time than that, so you would adjust the cues.
Yeah, I mean, it could be the orchestra itself, the level of the orchestra would determine, and because if it's a professional orchestra, even if it's, let's say it's not a degree of level of the orchestra in terms of like collegiate versus professional versus, you know, LA Phil versus like, not a full season orchestra, but they're professionals, okay? All right. Okay, so like Pasadena versus LA Phil. They're both professional, but Pasadena is per service and LA Phil is salary orchestra, right? So even then, you have to adjust for the orchestra, right? Plus, there will be factors that might be the different hall and acoustics, right? Some acoustics might be really wet, right? And that would be actually the reverberation would take longer, right? In which case you have to go a little bit slower, right? As opposed to it's a really dry hall and the reverberation doesn't last, right? So I think having a specific tempo is a good sort of base point, default point to start from. But there you have to make adjustment depending on who the orchestra is, what their level is, how big is it, right? Is it a Rider string that's doing it minimally as a ballet orchestra, where the string section is sort of a minimal, like 8 + 8 + 6 + 4 + 2 string section, or is an LA Phil full concert configuration of 14 firsts, 14 seconds, 12 violas, 12 cellos, and 8 basses, right? So that's like 44 versus like 68 string players. So just by sheer the number difference, that you have to adjust the tempo accordingly, right? So it might be that a particular recording, it was a size orchestra where it sounded right, even though it was a bit slower. Does that make sense? Yeah.
It's kind of a big difference.
It is a big difference. Yeah, I agree. I think 144 to 138. Stravinsky thinks that's perfect. So and Stravinsky goes 126. Right? So maybe 144 was a bit of a miscalculation on Stravinsky's part in putting 144 down. Maybe he wanted something that's a little bit slower, actually. Right? I mean, he's a human being. He's not God, right? So we have to make allowances for that. Stravinsky could have made a mistake in putting 144 down, right? So, yeah, in some ways, I wish this is the kind of data points I would want with every composer, right? But because Rider Spring is such a seminal piece in our repertoire, and the person who interviewed Stravinsky and brought these recordings, they did the right thing by asking, right, Stravinsky's opinion about all these different recordings. In some ways, another important emphasis why we can't rely on recordings, as we have seen with the ballade, right, where a simple choice of making the first allegro tempo too fast makes it impossible to make a distinction between the allegro ma non troppo with the piumoso tempo, right? And the final allegro section where you have con fuoco presto piumoso, right? So the importance of being able to look at a score and determine what tempo it is, right? And not relying on a random recording, right? Even if it's conducted by a famous person, right? As we see Karajan and Boulez and Maida and Stravinsky making mistakes and choosing the wrong tempos, right? I think perfect tempo is a term that should be utilized more. And I don't know why it's not, right? People make such a big deal out of perfect pitch, right? But in fact, perfect tempo is something you can practice, right? Okay, what is 60? Give us 60. Okay. Let me open up a page. Oh. 60. Ready? Okay. All right, let's do something a little bit difficult. I find 112 to be kind of hard to hit. 120 is much easier because you use double 60, but 112 is a little hard to hit directly. 112. All right, how about 152? Uh, one of my pet peeves, and I have to learn how to, and this is just my old age, okay? Because I grew up with metronome markings that are divisible by 3. Like 148, 152, 60, 80, right? So when I see composers put 103, what? Really? You can tell the difference between 103 and 104? 103? Right? So that's just my old baggage, okay? Because you guys work with notation programs that give you the ultimate control of, and so you're used to hearing, 100.3 or 126.5. That's an actual tempo for you guys, right? But for old musicians like me who have those click dials where it doesn't give you anything between 104 and 108, right? So that's just my baggage. But when I see composers write that tempo, like 103.5, I'm like, this is not an AM station. But that's just my baggage, okay? But I digress, okay? But I think that phenomenon of perfect tempo, unlike perfect pitch, where although there's an argument to be made, if you start early enough, like 3 or 4, then you can have perfect pitch. It's just exposure, okay? But perfect tempo is definitely something you can practice, right? You should have a tempo, a way to get a tempo, a general tempo, 60, 80, 100, 120, 160, right? And then you can be like close, right? But you should be not like more than 10 or 12 clicks out from the tempo that you want to hit, okay? So one great exercise to do, like 60 is really, just think 1001, 2002, right? Some people do it by 2. That's not as good of a shortcut, because what are you going to do? As you start a piece, think of something, another piece before you connect the piece in 120, right? So, but it can be a crutch, right? Have some system of way where you can practice, right? Another way I practice 100 is I do all my solfege exercises in 100. So then I get used to dividing that quarter note or that pulse into 8th note, triplet, 16th note, quintuplet, sextuplet, and 100. So that physically I'm memorizing that every day for 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Okay. All right. Any questions on the Stravinsky paper? I find this read to be really, really illuminating. So I would really encourage you to read the whole chapter. I'll send you links to all of these in the resource file. Okay. So in the resource folder, I made a folder for today's handouts. Where'd it go? Huh? What? Hang on. Yeah, there it is. Handout from today. Okay, so the 3 articles are there. Okay. And I will also add to this document. No, not that one. And I'll add the links that we looked at today. Dean Dixon article. The video, this is another audio recording of Dean Dixon conducting. Okay, so I'll add those also. Questions about the presentation that you'll do on Tuesday?
Do you have access to like sharing the slides?
Yeah, of course. Just send it to me prior to the class, and then I'll put it up so that it's ready to share. So shoot for about 10-minute presentation. Right? It's okay if you go a little further, a little more, but not okay if you go a little less. Right? at least 10 minutes. Okay? You should have, if you haven't picked out your article, maybe a resource, you can sort of do a double whammy and do explore link on the underrepresented document. You could pick something from that and review that as a resource. So you can kind of kill two birds with one stone. That's okay. I'll also send you a link to the Conductors Guild journal, so you can access those. Okay. If you can find another place, that would be another great way to talk about that resource. Okay, so I belong to the College Orchestra Directors Association. They have a similar kind of thing. ASTA, American String Teachers Association, also has a set of journal articles devoted to string technique and teaching of string instruments. Okay. So, and one of the things that you should be doing as a music major is really utilizing our library and looking at what resources there are for you to explore. Right? I mean, I told you that story of me trying to expand the contemporary music holdings at Northwestern and Michigan, right? You should be doing similar things with the Oxy Library and knowing what's available to you as a student who has access to the library. Right? I think sometimes as we become more digitally engaged in our society, sometimes I find myself reading less books, right? Because there's so many online resources that I have access to. Just the sheer number of recordings that are available on YouTube, right? I could just like a deep dive down a rabbit hole of like different versions, like what do people do on opening up Beethoven, whatever piece I'm working on, right? Rather than seeking out resources like these, the written resource articles, journal articles, and actual textbooks, right? So I hope you are not going through your collegiate experience without cracking open a book, right? About music, about subject that you're passionate about. Yeah, okay. So utilize the resources that are available to us in both our library, not just digital formats, but in paper formats and book formats and score formats. Certainly, you are in the age of abundance in terms of being able to access all kinds of things online. But I find it alarming. Many times I encounter students who have no idea even how to use the library system in terms of being able to requesting books or scores over interlibrary loan. How many of you have done an interlibrary loan? Okay, that's got to be addressed. Yeah.
They're not very good at getting back to you.
They are not. Yeah, they take like 4 weeks. Yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes the request just never gets answered.
Yeah. Sure. But I mean, I was actually able to access William Dawson's Negro African Symphony, which is not available because it's out of print. But they got it through the library local. Okay. All right. Input, output. Without input, you can't have no output. Okay. If you don't read, you're not going to have much ideas to present. So I would really encourage you to broaden your attention a little bit away from what's available online. Okay, because I just know it's harder for you to dive in that way. Because it's harder for me to dive in that way, right? Because there's so much available through this thing. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. I got through everything I wanted to get through. So unless there are questions, I'll see you after break. Thank you.